Welcome, welcome. It's 1 o'clock. It's time for some awesome FileMaker training. I'm Richard Carlton, creator of fmtraining.tv, where we are doing awesome live training every day, 1 o'clock Pacific time, and that's Monday through Friday. Today is day 3. It's the final day of our API classroom conversation with Art Sevilla. This is Art. Oops, shoot, there's Art. Hi, Art. Welcome, Art. Art, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Sorry, I was muted there. Welcome back, everybody.
Yep, Art is here. It's very exciting. Art, where are we going to be picking up the conversation today?
So today, where we're going to start off is we're going to actually go through a couple of the demos that we didn't get a chance to yesterday. So that's going to be the AccuWeather demo and a little bit of the Stripe demo, just to kind of show some of the more advanced features of the insert from URL script step. So we will look at that through Postman, and then we'll transfer over to FileMaker and talk about that. And then once we go through that, then we're going to talk about OAuth and where that comes into play and when you do use it, when you don't need to worry about it.
So we have a lot of material to cover. Two things I want to say first, and I will cover this now and cover it later. Once again, the reminder, this training is brought to you by fmtraining.tv, where you get the greatest in training. So once again, reminder that we do have training courses that are available on a subscription. We have a complete bundle here. Some of you need that or don't need that. Others of you need the video only training. So our daily live training is important, but it's not animated. So when we have complex topics, frequently we will animate a video. And so our recorded training that you get in the video training courses in a lot of ways is better than the live training. In the live training, though, we get to take questions, to answer questions, so that's really useful. So for those of you who don't like questions, if you don't like to watch questions or have people ask questions, you need to watch the recorded training. If you like questions or want to interact with us, this is the place to be. So I highly recommend, if you want to sponsor the channel, you want to help support the channel. Forget sponsoring it. Yeah, if you want to sponsor it like a race car, we'll put your name and company on the hood of our training channel, and we will make you an official sponsor. That being said, if you want to support the channel, buy the training, keep it up to date. We really appreciate that. Now, more importantly, not more importantly, but as important, if you want to see the current training schedule, you come up here and you go to live training. We talked about this about a week ago. We have finally fixed the issues with this. So what we have is this is the live training here that's coming up. This is today's schedule. Nick Hunter will be doing a free makeover on one or more people's FileMaker files. A couple of you have submitted this. We have, if you want to submit to us a FileMaker file that's kind of ugly and you would like Nick Hunter, and we don't have to mention your name, we don't have to embarrass you unless you want us to do that, and we will remake the file in terms of user interface, user experience. He will do that live over a couple-day event. If you want to submit that, you come down here to the FM training page, you go to live training right here. You're going to scroll down and you're going to press the link right here. This is the upload, okay? Now what happens here is we had a problem where it would fail if the upload took too long. We fixed all that. So what you have to do is you have to say you're not a robot. In this case, it already knew I wasn't a robot, but you might have to like identify the buses, the bikes, or the whatever. Identify the terrorists with guns or something in the photo, and you click them up, and then it knows that you're not a robot. And then you could give us your name, email. Let us know the access code to the file. I have a couple people sending us files with, we don't have access codes and we can't get into the file. You're limited to 256 megabytes, and you can submit up to, looks like 2 files here. So feel free to get that going. Really appreciate it. Let us know. That way we can select the solutions that we can really help, and we will do that in live TV in about 2 weeks on a live stream. So go ahead and go through that process if you want. I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over, and we're going to start the last day 3 of our API training. Keep in mind, we're going to run long today. As a result of running long, I don't have a real end for this. It's going to be probably an hour, 90 minutes anyway. So Art, you ready to go?
Yes, I am ready to go.
Go ahead and switch yourself to your desktop.
My screen here. Let me get that situated there. So there.
And then
we go.
you're at 720, so hopefully it will look fairly decent for everyone, right? So.
Yeah, it should be a little.
And you can move my thing because everyone can see that. If you want to move that down or out of the way or wherever, it's fine.
No, I didn't realize that was.
We can see it all, baby.
All right. So just as a note to start, we tried to do a follow along session yesterday, which didn't necessarily work out too well with the API sign up and whatnot. So the structure for today is going to be a little bit different. We're going to actually more so just go through the content as opposed to, giving demo files and trying to have people walk through it with us.
We will give you the demo files, but the idea is you can walk through it watching the recorded version later instead of us trying
Right.
to answer, because really it's a classroom setting. I'd love to do a classroom setting. I would love people here and I could help you. But first off, we got people who show up late, 15 minutes late, and then they go, what the hell, and where's the sample files? And the thing is, when you log on to watch the video, you don't see the previous conversation on the chat as a general rule, and so you don't see the link. So it's if we could figure out how to make a classroom setting really work, that would be really cool. I'd be happy to help everyone with that. We just have to figure out how to make that work. Anyway, so sorry, Art,
Right.
you may continue.
So with that being said, we are going to try to hold most questions until the end, so that way we can just kind of keep moving. You can still ask your questions as we go along. It's just we might not address them right away. People in the chat might address them as they can, but I won't be making pauses very much to address those.
All right, well, you have to take a breath, and then I will interrupt. How about that?
That'll work. It's
And then
just we have a lot to go through today, and
well,
based on yesterday, I want to make sure we have enough time to get through it today.
okay, all right, off you go.
All right. So where we kind of left off yesterday, we had gone through Postman, how to work with Postman, get your call to the API, see what it returns to you, what format the JSON is in, and what information you need to pull out of that. The API that we used yesterday did not have any kind of security or authorization. It was a free public use API that did not require any kind of sign up or API key or anything like that. So we didn't get into any of the other options here, headers or authorization or anything like that. So what we're going to do today to start is to talk about that, because that will lead into the conversation with OAuth, because once you know how to deal with authorization, whether it be through an API key or a username password combo, that's all going to be the same once you get past the OAuth flow. So we'll talk about that once we get past this. So if you recall yesterday, the Venn lookup, like I said, does not have any kind of security. So what we're going to do now is look at an API that does require some kind of security. In this case, the AccuWeather API. It requires you to have an API key. So you go to their website, you sign up. They do have a free tier. We did go through some of that yesterday. So if you were here yesterday, you likely have an API key for that already. In Postman, you'll need to be able to keep track of that API key, because that is what authorizes you to use their services. So if you don't have a valid API key and you try to make a call to their API, they're going to reject you. It's going to spit back an error saying, hey, you didn't give us an API key. We don't know who you are. We don't know if you're, verified to use our service. So you don't get any data. And obviously, this becomes a little bit more complex. So if we look at our VIN number, where it's essentially a URL and one query parameter, which this parameter goes into the URL. So if you see, we have format here and JSON, and then we have format equals JSON here. Query parameters throw it into the URL. These headers and body here, which we'll get to in a second, these two are those hidden values that Richard mentioned yesterday. So in a web browser, you would put this into the URL field in your web browser, and it would take you to a website. These require some extra information that you pass in a different format. So it's not in the URL, it's in that hidden format that Richard had briefly mentioned in yesterday's session. So we're going to go through that here with the weather API. So over here, where that API key comes into play, it can come into play in one of two places. Here in the weather API, they require it as part of the query parameters, meaning that it's sent as part of the URL here. Other APIs will require that you send it in the header. And we'll talk about that here in just a second when I get to the Stripe API, because the Stripe API requires that. But here with the weather API, all they require is that you pass it in the query parameters, meaning that it gets put here in the URL. They also take some other parameters. So they take what language you're using in their documentation on their website on AccuWeather Developer Center. They give you the list of supported languages and the codes corresponding. So if you're in a different country using a different language, there is a code that corresponds to that. Details here tells it whether or not we want a verbose result or just basic information. So setting that to false gives us a shorter result, whereas setting it to true just gives us a lot more information as part of that result. Alias, this is something specific to their API. This is kind of a loose search that lets them find some close matches. It doesn't have to be an exact match. And then a limit is how many results will get returned by this call. So if there are 1,000 results by this call, close matches to Los Angeles, it's only going to give me 100 at a time. There's a parameter that you can pass called offset, which handles paging. So if there were 1,000 that were returned and I gave it a limit of 100, if I don't pass an offset, it gives me the first 100 of that 1,000 set. If I pass it an offset of 100, it gives me the record or the results 100 to 200. And so you kind of you do that. Some APIs do that to handle the bandwidth so that you're not trying to load in a bunch of data at once. So these parameters are specific to this API. So other APIs will have different parameters that they require you to pass, either here in the query parameters, or like I said, we'll talk about this here in a second with the headers and the body. But the weather API is one of the more simple ones that requires an API key, because again, all you have to do is pass it here in the URL, the query parameters. So if we go to our AccuWeather demo, which was included in the work files yesterday. So if you happen to have that right now, you can actually open that up and follow along at this point. This is the demo file here. And so we'll need to have the base URL, which in your work file should already be in there. The API key, if you were here in the session yesterday and you went through that particular part of the session, you should already have one of these. If you don't, we will include the information on how to get that in the description on the video when we upload it. But once you have this information, the API key, you need to pass it in the URL. So in FileMaker, how we do that a couple ways we can do that. So the first way I'm going to show you is using what's called curl. So in FileMaker 16, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, FileMaker 16, I believe FileMaker added the ability to use curl options in the insert from URL script step.
Yeah, 16 or 17 they added that, and then they, of course, initially they went one way and then they started refining it, so now it's pretty well dialed in.
Right. And so curl options are client URL options, meaning that it essentially allows you to configure the call to get a certain response, meaning that you can tell it in the curl options, you tell it which method you're trying to use, and the method means what we're trying to do. So whether we're trying to get information using a get command or trying to push information using a post, put, or update command. And that I'll talk about in a little bit as well when I get into more detail about the curl options here in the script. But the curl options, you tell it which method you're using, you give it the headers that the API requires, and you also give it any parameters that the API requires. So for example, let's say you're trying to post or upload a new customer to your Stripe account. You would use a post method to push that information from FileMaker to Stripe. And once Stripe receives that information on their end, they know that you're pushing data to them by the post command, and then they parse that on their end, create the new record, and then they spit you back the results of the new record, essentially, the new ID, the new name, all of that. So method is what we're doing. Headers are modifiers, I guess you could call them. They tell the API a little bit more information. So if we look over here at the weather API. Or sorry, not the weather API. It's going to be the Stripe one. So here in Stripe, if you can see here under headers, we have two headers. We have one called authorization and we have one called content type. So certain APIs will require these headers. So they're different from parameters. These parameters go into the URL, like I mentioned. So if we look at the weather again, you can see those query parameters here are in the URL. Over here, the headers do not go into the URL. They are kind of hidden in the background. And certain APIs will require certain headers depending on what you're doing and what their requirements are. So for Stripe, we have to authorize ourselves. We have to tell them, hey, we can actually access this information for this account that we're trying to reach. So they give us a pair of private keys, very similar to how the AccuWeather keys work. So that sign-up process, creating the new app, generating the key. For Stripe, it's a very similar process, and for other APIs, it's a very similar process for them as well. Here is the content type. This tells the API what we're sending them. So if we are posting, if we're pushing information to the API, we have to tell them what format we're sending it in. So we use a header content type to tell them, hey, we're sending it in this format called application and then www form URL encoded. This corresponds to our body here. So our body is the data that we're actually passing to them. So in this example where we're passing a new customer to Stripe, our body would contain their first name, their last name, their email, any card information or whatever other contact information for the customer record. So we could add, a first name field here. They have a set of values that we can set for the customer. We set it in a body. Again, we pass this hidden. So this is something that you would not see in the URL. It would just be something that you set in the background that gets set through the curl options. And I'll show you what this will look like in curl format once we get there in just a minute. And there are other options here. So URL form encoded lets you do key value pairs, which is pretty nice because you can easily just do the key and then put your value here. Form data is very similar. It's not URL encoded. URL encoded means that it replaces certain characters that are not web safe. It replaces them with like a substitute representation of it. So for example, if I wanted to encode Los Angeles, because there's a space in there, a UR encoded would give me Los Angeles %20 Angeles or Los %20 Angeles. So that's the difference between those two. I won't get too far into that because again, these are somewhat different, but your use will depend on the API that you're using. So raw, you can just type in raw JSON in here. So if I wanted to just type in my own JSON representation, I could actually start typing in my own JSON, and that is what would get sent with the request. So here, for the Stripe one, we have our authorization, we have our content. If I were to hit send, it would send the post command to Stripe. And let me change my environment here. So if I hit send, it's going to return a new customer. So it just created a new customer, and there's a bunch of default fields that they set on their end, and they just return the value. So I didn't pass them a name or an email or anything like that. The only thing they require is just a call to this endpoint, and they return to you a customer ID. The rest of it you can pass if you want. It's optional. First name, last name, email, that's all optional. Now, going back to curl, now that we've made the call, here there's a button called code, which actually shows you the raw curl command. And this is what the curl representation of what we just did. So curl format it's curl options, so you can have a bunch of these combined. So the first thing in the curl is the location. So it's the method that you're using. So right here you can see post and the URL that we are aiming at. So in this case, it's the Stripe API URL. Then we have our header curl options. So we have a specific tag here. There's a list of these, and we'll give a link to the FileMaker supported ones. They have it all listed out and what they do. But you have a tag here. So we have header, and in the single quote, before the colon, we have the header name. So we have authorization and we have content type, those two headers that we had back here. And then after the after the colon, there's a space and then whatever that value is. So those are headers. And you can see they just repeat here and follow that same format. On a post, because we're going to be passing data to the API, there's another tag that tells it, hey, we are passing some data and it is URL encoded. And then it formats the parameters here. So here we have the key, so description, and here separated by the equal sign with the value here. And then we have the second parameter, source, separated by equal and token. So that curl command passes the information over to the API. How does that translate back over here to FileMaker? So in our weather demo, I have this button here, and actually I added this yesterday, so you probably don't have this in your current file, but we can push an update in the work file link that we'll post with this video. Created a second script, duplicated the get weather current condition script, and created a duplicate of it that uses curl options just to show you guys how that works in FileMaker. So what we'll do here, again, the weather API only takes it takes the API key in the URL query. So what we're going to do is we're going to format the query. So everything after the question mark here in a URL, that question mark is the delimiter for the query. So everything after that question mark is part of the query. So for the variable in FileMaker, we're going to set this up using concatenation. So if we look at the calculation here, we have question mark API key equals, and then our API key is being stored in a field here in FileMaker. So we concatenate that with the ampersand here. So now we have our query. Then we build our URL. So we have a base URL, which again is set in a field in the FileMaker solution here. And we concatenate that with the endpoint. So the endpoint is the part of the API that we're targeting. So each API has usually has multiple endpoints that give you different information. So in this instance, we're looking for current conditions. So the endpoint for current conditions is the base URL, which is dataservice.accuweather.com /current conditions /v1. And then our location ID, which is a parameter from AccuWeather. So that's on their documentation for this endpoint. And let me show you what that will look like on their documentation page. So on their API reference, these are the current condition. This is the current conditions API, and they have different endpoints for this particular part of the API. The one that I'm showing you in that example is the current conditions, and they give you the endpoint right here. And they also tell you what parameters they are expecting. So normally when you see curly braces with a name in it, that usually denotes a variable. And a lot of API documentation will use this syntax. So just keep that in mind, that if you see curly braces with a name in it, that usually means it's a variable name or a parameter name. So in this case, we need to send it our location key. So over here back in FileMaker, we store that with a variable. And that variable is passed as a script parameter. If you're not familiar with script parameters, that is something that you should definitely look into, because it is a very powerful tool to pass information between scripts. So if you have questions about that, I believe we have some videos talking about that, but something that you should definitely know when scripting. Now back over here to the URL. So we, oh, go ahead, Richard.
I have a question, but I'm not allowed to ask questions.
Yeah.
I have a question, so I can't. I don't want anyone to hear the question. No one can see the question. David wants to know if you can confirm that yesterday's files were all they need, or you have new files.
We will have an updated file for this one, because I did make a change from yesterday to the AccuWeather one, but the other two are fine.
Okay.
The other two in yesterday's download.
Don't say anything. I'll let David know. Okay.
All right.
We're back. We're back.
All right. So now we are back with the rest of the curl options here. So now the next step here, after we set the URL, so we set the URL for the endpoint that we're looking at, and then as you can see here, we're actually concatenating our query. So that variable that we set right above it, we're concatenating that. And so URL will end up looking like this. So that variable that we just set, it's going to spit out this exact URL. Then the next step is to set the method string. So in curl, there are options, again, as I said, and I'm going to show you what those options are, at least the FileMaker supported ones. So this page is part of the FileMaker documentation, and it's titled supported curl options. So there are various curl options, but FileMaker only supports this list. So there are some other curl options that you might run across that aren't supported by FileMaker. So far in my work with APIs, I haven't run into any that are used that aren't supported by FileMaker. So I think for the most part, people will be okay. But it's something to keep in mind, because you might run into some kind of obscure API that requires you to do some kind of weird curl command that isn't supported by FileMaker. But largely, like I said, I haven't run into this problem, so I don't think anybody, again, unless you're doing some kind of obscure API and they have some weird requirement to use an unsupported curl command, I don't think you will run into that issue. So one of the curl commands that we're going to use is this one right here. So this one, there are two ways, usually there are two ways to write a curl command. And in this list, it gives you both of them. And some of them only have one, but a lot of them have two different ways to say the same thing. So in this case, we have request, which is right here, a command. So we're basically telling the server to do something, is what this part of the curl option is. So we can either write it as -- request, or we can write it as -X. Capital X is important because the curl options are case sensitive. So if you type in a lowercase x, that is a different command. And actually, I can show you exactly what that one is. So down here, or up here, lowercase x is a totally different curl option. So they are case sensitive, and that is something to keep in mind. So we're going to go through a couple of these options right here, at least for this weather call, that are being used. So the first one that is used is the request one. And again, we can write it in one of two ways. So in this, I wrote it the short way with the single hyphen and the uppercase X. But technically, you can write it like this as well, and that is the same exact thing. After that, you tell it the method. So that can be get. Again, that is if we're pulling information from an API. We can do post if we're pushing something to an API. We can do put, which will replace information based on an existing record. There's an update command and a patch command, which are similar to put. Those three commands are very similar. I won't necessarily go into detail about those right now, just because we won't necessarily be using them in our examples today. The only one we'll be using is post, but towards the end, if there's questions specifically about that, I can address, what the specific differences are. But for now, get and post are what we're going to be using. So in this particular instance, because we're pulling the weather information from AccuWeather, we need to make a get call. So our method is get. After our method, we need to put our headers together. So if we go back to our list of options here, if you see, the option for adding headers is -- header or -H. So in our header string, because AccuWeather is expecting us to give it a content type of application JSON, that is what we need to set our header string to. So the way that you format this is you put the header tag, the header option here. And again, you can either do it with the H or double hyphen and header. I just prefer to do it the short way. And then space, the header that you're actually setting needs to be encapsulated in quotes. So if you're quoting within FileMaker, you have to do escape quotes, which you do by doing a \quote, and that adds a quote in the quoted text. So if you're not too familiar with that, that might be a little confusing at first, but this needs to be quoted. And to quote quoted text in FileMaker, you have to escape it, which the escape for a quote is \quote. So now we have our single header that we need. So this option right here, so this is the capital D. This is our dump header. This is actually pretty important for debugging, especially when you're first putting in the API, you haven't worked with it for a while, you're not really sure what to expect. The dump header becomes extremely valuable because it'll give you the response headers. So let me show you what that means. Every time you make a call to an API, not only does it give you data, but it also returns response headers. And sometimes there's information that you need to get out of here in the response, depending on the API and what you're doing. So that is what this option does. So dump header stores those headers in a variable. So when we do -D or ~dump headers, and we give it a variable, it's going to dump those headers in this variable. So once we make the call, we can access the headers from this variable. So now, down here on line 33, we put all of that together. So we have our method string, and we concatenate this all with spaces. So they're on different lines just to kind of make it easier to read the variables. But we have our method string, we have our header string, our auth string and data string. We don't need to worry about that right now because again, the AccuWeather one doesn't apply to the AccuWeather one. And then our FM options here. So if I were to run that in Script Debugger, and for this example, this curl test button, I'm just passing it a location ID that I already just got from a previous step. So it's going to give me the current weather conditions for, I think that one is San Luis Obispo, so my current area. So we'll go through this. So we have our location ID. We're going to open up Data Viewer so we can see these values as they come in. So we have our location ID. And we do a little quick check at the beginning of the script just to make sure that we got a location ID. Otherwise, if we don't, we exit out. Then we get to the part where we set up our curl command or curl options. So we're going through these variables. As you can see, here is the query option, the query parameter. So API key, and there's my API key. And then we have the URL, which puts all of that together. So here is the, oops. So here is the endpoint that we got from the documentation. Here is the location ID, which is the query parameter. Or sorry, not the query parameter, but the endpoint parameter. So that was the item that's in curly braces here, the location key. And then we have that question mark that I mentioned. So that notates that these are all query parameters. So we have our API key and then the API key. So that's the URL. Oh, and actually, I just realized I skipped over one last part here before we actually run that through the script debugger. My apologies there. The insert from URL step. So setting this up, kind of glossed over that just now. So let me go through that quickly here. Insert from URL allows you to do exactly what it says there, insert from a URL. But starting with 16, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, FileMaker, or now Claris, they added the compatibility with curl options. And again, that is a limited list of curl options, but it does hold most of the more commonly used ones. So to configure this, we need to set a target, select entire contents. That doesn't really matter here. We can actually just deselect that. The target, we can either set that into a field in a table, or we can set it to a variable. So in this situation, I set it to $result. The next option is to specify the URL. So the URL in there is going to be what we set up over here. So on step 29, we're going to go here to specify URL, and we're going to do $URL. Leave the automatically encode URL box checked. That's fine. Verify SSL certificates. We don't need to worry about that right now because this particular API doesn't have any kind of requirements for that. So that you can skip. Then our curl options. So this variable that we set down here, number 33, curl options, we're going to specify and set that there. So that configures the insert from URL script step. So now going back to script debugger, and back to data viewer, we can look at our variables that we set. So we went through the query, we went through the URL, here's the method string, here's the location ID, and here's the header string. So it was probably a little hard to visualize when I was showing it to you in the set variable step, but this is what that does. So the backslash quote, it makes it so that it puts the quotes in here once it evaluates the actual string. So we have our header there. We have our FileMaker options, which are the dump headers, the response headers. And now if I step one more, we put it all together. And that's our curl. So now on this step, the insert from URL, this is actually going to make the call. So if I step over, it made the call with all of the settings, all the options that I set on it, and it put the result in that variable $result. So if we come over here to data viewer, if we look at, here we go, result. And there is our JSON. Just like here. And then of course we go through and we parse that just like we did yesterday with the VIN number. So we use our JSON get element and we parse using the values or the key names for the JSON object that we get back. So that's very similar to what we went over in the VIN demo yesterday. So I'm not going to cover that part today. The main thing are the curl options here. So this is how to do them manually. I don't do this. As I mentioned yesterday, I use a script that was written by Todd Geist, and it is included in his product Geist Generator, which is a free download on his website. We'll include a link for that as well if you guys are curious to explore that. But I pulled out a script that he uses for that file that makes it a lot easier to deal with APIs so that you don't have to necessarily do all of this by hand. That script is the HTTP native script. So I did a very condensed version of that in this curl option script. So this part right here, this is a very condensed version of what actually happens in this HTTP request script. So Todd Geist essentially wrote the script to take a JSON object. So you have to format JSON in a specific way. And then he parses through the JSON that you give him or give the script. And then it generates the curl options and does the insert from URL script step right here. It does all of that for you. And all you have to do is set up the JSON. So right here in this example, current conditions, I'm using that script, HTTP native, and I'm using the format of parameters to pass to that script. So as you can see here, I use the JSON set element function to create a JSON object that the script can then parse and create my curl options for. So it takes a parameter URL, so we pass it the URL just like we made up at the top. We don't need to add the query parameters like we did in the previous example, because that is handled by a JSON key. So we only pass it the base URL, so pretty much everything up to the question mark, set the method get, and then we set the query. So query is the JSON key that the script is looking for to do the query parameters, to do the question mark and then the parameters afterwards. That you set here. So we have query, which is the key, and then within that JSON, we have another key called API key that we pass our AccuWeather API key to. And we also have another query parameter called language, where we set that language parameter. Then we set headers, so we have headers.content type, and then we pass that content type application JSON. And then if we were doing a post, we would, put any data that we're actually passing over to the API. As you can see, this is a lot easier to work with than having to write this part over and over again. And the other thing that this script actually does, so we had the dump headers right here. When we do it ourselves, I didn't do it here in this example, but we have to parse the headers ourselves to be able to pull them out. The script, the HTTP native, actually does that for us. And so there's actually a part in the response. So once we make the call, once we pass our request JSON, we then get a script result, which is the API response. And that includes the JSON that it might return if there's no errors, and the headers. So we have to parse that out. We can get a result from a script by using the function getScriptResult. So we set that to our variable here, result. The script formats the response in a very specific way. So it gives us a code, which is our HTTP response code. That is a code from the server, the API server, that tells you how the response went, like what the result of the response is. And the responses that you want to see are in the 200 range. So if you see 200, 201, 202, those usually mean that the response went, or the request went through correctly. If you see like a 400, that usually means like there's some kind of error with the request that you made. If there's a 500 HTTP response, that usually means that there's something wrong on their end. So these codes respond to something, or correspond to something, and it's a pretty standard list of HTTP response codes, that is kept track of in the result here. So in the response, we can pull out that HTTP code by pulling out the key code from the result. The body, so this part, the actual JSON here that gets returned from the API, that is kept track of in an element called body. So we pull that out from the result. And then from there, we go through and we parse out the JSON just like we did with the VIN number. And that makes, honestly, life a lot easier. Again, all you have to do is copy and paste this into your solutions where you're going to be dealing with an API. All you have to do is set up this JSON object in this format and then pass it to that script, and it makes those calls or that part of the process a lot easier because you don't have to necessarily worry about it, and you don't have to do specific scripts for each part of the API process. So for each call, all you have to do, so if you can see here on the location search, here's that call. On the general text search, here's that call again, just 2 lines. Here's that call again. And here's that call again. So it's a lot easier just and more dynamic to set that up than trying to write the curl options yourself. It's nice. It's definitely good to know how this works on the behind the scenes, just so that you're aware of what curl is and how it functions. But once you know how to do that, then why make it harder on yourself to write that every single time? Use a tool that someone has provided for you that works very reliably. So again, I use this mostly. I hardly ever do this anymore. I don't write the curl options out like this anymore. I use this script. Yes, so that just kind of starts to lead into the OAuth question, or the OAuth conversation. So I'm going to talk about what OAuth is, where it's used, and when to use it. And then I'm going to show you a couple of demos that use OAuth and how to implement OAuth into a FileMaker solution. And there's 2 ways to do that. There's a really right way to do it and kind of a hack way to do it. So I'm going to show you both. I recommend doing it the correct way, but not every situation might accommodate that. So we'll kind of go through that here too. So I don't think that'll take more than maybe another 20 minutes or so to go through that content there. All right, so that talks about the API key usage. And again, if you have any questions, make sure to ask them towards the end here. We're going to try to leave maybe 10 minutes or so to take some questions, and any questions that we don't get to, send them out to support@rcconsulting.com, and we'll try to get to them there. All right, so OAuth. What is OAuth? So we just talked about API keys as a way to kind of secure, or at least let the service runner know who's utilizing their service, their API. So the API is a unique identifier or the API key is a unique identifier that allows that service to track people, their usage. So if they charge for their service, they can track by the usage on that key. And also they use it for authentication. So if you don't have a valid key, you can't use their service. OAuth is kind of a layer on top of that. OAuth is a series of protocols that are used for authorization on the web when dealing with a third party. What does that mean? Let's say, for example, for Square, the payment processor, Square has their own service that they run. So they have like a POS service, they have an online store service, they have payment processing, they can do invoices, they can do a lot of that stuff on their service. They offer an API that allows developers to integrate their their system, their API into their software, into their own application, but allow people, third-party users, to sign into their own accounts using this third-party software. So it's not an app from Square, the parent company, it's from a third party, but Square is allowing that third party to have their clients log into their web, into their app, and access their Square information. So OAuth is a layer between, in this example, Square and, let's say, me building a Square application. OAuth is an authorization protocol that um, basically allows me to use their service with other people's accounts. Um, so again, mostly third parties. And there are two different versions of OAuth. OAuth 1 is not used all that much anymore. It's kind of been faded out. Now what you'll see is OAuth 2. You might still see OAuth 1 mentioned here and there in some documentation, as they do have OAuth 1 support for like legacy support on either older clients or older software, what have you. So certain APIs will still support OAuth 1. Usually they'll have an OAuth 2 method that they kind of push everybody to, but again, OAuth 1 is kept there for compatibility. Um, OAuth 1 had a bunch of problems. I mean, it was brought up from Flickr and Google. They had kind of a system in place where they were authorizing third parties to use their service. So, if you saw like a Google YouTube app that wasn't made by Google and they allowed you to sign into your YouTube account, that's where this came from. They had the use for that, and so they built a system for that. But it was kind of just on their own, and they didn't necessarily collaborate on it. So it was kind of all over the place. It wasn't necessarily a set standard, and there was a lot of confusion, and it was a little bit more complicated to implement. So OAuth 2 was brought out to address that problem. So it's a complete rewrite, again, made to simplify the problem areas of 1. And this one was in collaboration with a lot more companies. So it wasn't just the two, Flickr and Google, it was from a larger collaboration of companies to kind of come up with a standard for this. So again, when to use OAuth, if your app will allow your users to sign into their own accounts, you must use OAuth. So for example, if RCC wanted to distribute FMSP with Dropbox integration, let's say, we can write a process that uses the OAuth flow that will allow a user to sign into their Dropbox account, and that gives us a token. So OAuth gives us a token, not an API key, but it's very much the same concept. OAuth gives us a token that we can use to get the information from their Dropbox account. So otherwise, if you're just using it for internal use, meaning that you're not going to have a client, you're not going to like market this application, you're not going to have different people signing into it with their own accounts, you're just going to use one internal or company account. Usually those APIs will give you some kind of API key or generate a token for you to use so that you don't have to deal with the OAuth flow. And I'll go through that in the demos here in just a second. So that's kind of a brief overview of OAuth. Again, it's a authentication protocol, and it is largely used for third-party interactions. So meaning that you are building an app that you're going to serve your customers with, and they're going to be able to sign into their own account with that parent company. So go and open up a couple demo files for that here. So first one I'm going to show you is just a Dropbox OAuth. So Dropbox does have an OAuth flow for using their API. And the way that OAuth works is OAuth 2 usually will require what's called a redirect URI. That is a website that the API will point to pass a token or a code, an authorization code, to then get the OAuth token down here. So the way that this works is you have to make a call to OAuth's endpoint. So in Dropbox specifically, they have an endpoint called dropbox.com/OAuth2. If we go into the script here, but actually, before I go into the script, let me just show you how this works. So minimum requirement is an app key, an app secret from the development center. So that process for getting those credentials is very much like what we went through with the Weather API. So you would go to Dropbox. If you already have an account, you can go to the Dropbox Development Center, and there's a spot there to create a new development app and get keys from that. We can post some links to those websites and that documentation as part of the description in this video. But once you have all that information in this sample file, once you put in the app secret and the app key, it'll convert base64. So this just happens in the background as you put the app secret and the app key. I'm going to hit login. It's going to go to Dropbox's website. So if you see here, dropbox.com, and it's giving me a warning saying, hey, before you connect this app, make sure that you know and trust this developer. Allowing apps from developer you know may put your data at risk. So there's just a warning that comes up whenever a third party is trying to use or trying to log in with Dropbox or authorize itself to use Dropbox's information. So we hit continue here. And then it tells me, hey, FM Starting Point would like to access files and folders in your Dropbox. Would you like to allow that or not? So if you hit cancel, obviously it doesn't go through. If I hit allow, what's going to happen now is it's going to give me this token. And then I can go grab this token, put it in the authorization code. And so that's a two-part. Oh wait, this is V2. This should have. Oh, my apologies. I opened up the wrong demo file.
All right, just keep in mind you're flipping around at about 9,000 miles an hour. So I'm confused, and I guarantee other people are confused. So make sure that when you do this, pick it up, that you kind of traipse through it at kind of some sort of normal speed here.
Right. I'm just trying to find my windows here because I moved them around a little bit. All right. So
all right.
I'm going over the overall
perfect
process for OAuth.
Perfect.
So this is the step by step, and then I'm going to go through it in the FileMaker. All right, so dragging this window over, and so this is from Dropbox's development guide directly. OAuth largely follows the same flow through most APIs. Some APIs have a very specific implementation of OAuth, but largely it follows the same kind of pattern. But essentially what happens with OAuth is it's a two-step process. So the first part of the process is the authorize. So authorizing means that you have to sign into your Dropbox account. So the URL here is an authorization URL that takes you to Dropbox's website. And if you're already signed in, then you'll see the page that I just showed you. So you know, this page right here. So if you're already signed in, it'll just show you this page. If you aren't signed in, then it will have you sign in. Once you sign in, then you'll get this page. And once you hit continue, and then allow, you're telling Dropbox that you want to authorize this application to use your Dropbox information. So that's step one. authorization. And once you hit allow, what then happens is an authorization code is then given to you. So, and we'll go through how Dropbox actually goes through and gives you that code. But once you hit allow, then it starts the second part of the process, which is getting a token. So once you have your authorization code, you need to pass that code back to Dropbox, and there is an endpoint, a token endpoint, where you pass that. So you give it to Dropbox through this token endpoint, and then what happens once they get it and they verify it, then they give you what's called an access token. And that access token is then what you'll use to make each subsequent call. So that access token at that point is like your API key. So OAuth is essentially a flow, an authentication flow to get that API key. It's a dynamic process to get that API key rather than going to a development center and just setting a static API key that you just plug in. This allows you to get it dynamically and having people sign into their own accounts securely. So it's a two-step process to go through OAuth and validate and authorize the user. So over here in FileMaker, this button right here, this first button, is to get the authorization code. So if I hit this, it's going to make that first call, which then again takes me here to authorize it. And when I hit allow, this is the authorization code that I was talking about. So this is the end of the first step. So in this example, if we copy this and we paste it over here in authorization code, now I can get my access token. So if I hit this button, it's going to make that second call that I mentioned to get the OAuth token, which is essentially the API key in this context. So if I do that now, it's going to make a call to the server.
Yeah.
It's not a necessarily an easy subject. I mean, there's a lot to go through, and I mean, I'm trying to simplify it as much as I can, but honestly, it really just takes people getting into it and starting to do it on their own and getting into it and getting
If you
exposed.
do it
And
full time as a job, it makes sense. It's easy that way. But if you just do it like I do it, I don't do it enough to do it to really get my head really wrapped around it. I do other stuff in FileMaker. Um,
right,
but yeah, I mean, if you do it all day, every day, then you get acclimated to it. I mean, Christian just pointed out that Art is very wouldn't tell you this, but he actually is taking. He's had a number of customers that pick up work, and then a couple that, of course, are not doing work right now because of all the economic stuff. So, if someone needs API level assistance, you can get Art to help you if you want. And actually, Art's not even really that expensive. You're cheap, Art. You're just cheap or inexpensive.
yeah.
So
And
yeah.
Jeffrey, I see your comment there. Jeffrey is actually in here on
Which
the
one's
Twitch stream, and he commented.
which Jeffrey is that?
JSCRNA.
Okay, that's one
Jeffrey
of those
Smith.
like
He's
phonetic. Yeah,
one of my good customers.
he's one of your customers. Well, you can't okay.
Yeah.
That's like loading the room full of like paid advocates for you, right? You can't have those people. Jeffrey, you're not allowed to talk about. No. You can't tell people how great Art is. Art, you're a bad person.
All right,
how many people here are actually your customers in here?
I'm not sure. I think he's the only one that I'm aware of.
All right.
But potentially a few.
Okay. Well, long as they.
All right. Yeah. So we got this going again. So, but we're getting there. So so again, the first part of this process to get the authorization code. So I'm going to hit this button again. It's going to then take me to that Dropbox authorization page. So I'm going to go ahead and hit, continue and allow. And then it gives me my authorization code. So if I copy this and I come back over here to the file and I paste it in there, and I hit get access token, it's going to make that second call where it passes this back to Dropbox. along with some other information, which we'll take a look at in the script here. But it's going to pass that code back to Dropbox, and Dropbox is going to verify it with some of the other information that I pass it, including the key. I can't remember if the secret goes along part of that, but I think it does. And then the authorization code. So once they verify all of that, then they give me back the access token. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this button here. And so now I have my OAuth 2 access token. And I've already parsed it all out of the JSON, but this is what the raw JSON looks like. So right here, again, I use the Todd Geist HTTP native script. So it spits out JSON. So here we have our body, which is the data that Dropbox gives us back. We have the code, which is from the HTTP response header. And then we have the headers that Dropbox sends us back as part of the response. And then we have a status here. So we pulled out our access token. So now this access token is what we then will use for each subsequent call to the Dropbox API. So if we need to post a file or download a file or get a list of folders, and that is what we'll pass to Dropbox in the authorization header. So in the authorization header, you would pass that key, and then when they get that on their end, they would know that, hey, this is a valid access token, and so we're going to let them have access to that information. And that I won't go too much into because I actually don't have a demo of Dropbox actually pushing files and pulling files. The only thing that this is doing right now is the OAuth authorization part of it. But that part works largely the same as what we were doing in the AccuWeather demo, except instead of passing the access token in the query parameters like we did with the AccuWeather, we would pass it as a header, in the curl options. So this is the basic of OAuth. Again, it's basically a two-part process: authorization code and then an access token. Fortunately, with Dropbox, they give us an easy way to deal with this. Obviously, ideally, we wouldn't want people to have to, copy and paste codes over like this. We would want to just kind of have that happen without the user, other than them logging in to verify and give access to their account. We wouldn't want them to have to copy and paste this. So Dropbox provides a nice, clean way to do this because they just give you a page where you can copy and paste. But the other way to do it without having to copy and paste like that, this is a little bit more, actually it's not a little bit more, it's quite a bit more advanced. So I'm going to talk about it just in a kind of an abstract way because it has to deal with PHP and FileMaker server. And so this method is technically the correct method to deal with OAuth. But again, it is more advanced and you will likely have to have somebody help you do this. So, so as you can see, this file is a little bit different because I have get authorization code and then get access token. This over here is just all one process. So I've set it up in such a way that I don't have to copy this code. It actually just passes it straight back to FileMaker directly. And I'm going to go through that really quickly just to show you the difference, but I just need to make sure my my API keys are correct here, because again, I made some changes to these files. And Richard, I didn't want to go too much in detail into this one just because again, it does involve PHP and server.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do have a question from David here, and I don't know how, because I've been doing about 5 different things here. David says, I am lost in the flow. You get the auth code, you get the auth code, and auth code is like a 2-step handshake process, right? So if I'm go ahead. Well, there's two. I mean, from my perspective, you're going to go through a process either at the time you talk to the service of getting a token, right? Is that what he's talking about, or is he talking about getting the authorization code at the Well, you go ahead and take it, but you understand the point, right? I mean, you can log on, but you
Yeah,
have to get some sort of token that's either you reset it every time, because tokens tend to time out, right? Either you have a token, and it's your like your
they do.
secret key, right? And that's one thing. So I guess you could use that. I mean, it depends on the
And
service.
the expiration, that's something I'll go into here in the GoTo Meeting demo that I'm about to show. But to kind of answer the question, the OAuth flow is a two-step process. The goal of the two-step process is to end up with the access token. So the first part of that process is to send the app key, which you get in the development center. And again, I haven't walked through the script on here, but I guess actually I can just do that now. So the first part of it is to get the auth token, the authorization token, from the authorized endpoint. So Dropbox has an OAuth 2 authorized endpoint. We pass it our app key, and then we tell it what kind of response type we're looking for. So we're telling it we're looking for an authorization code, so we pass it code. There's other response types that we can do, but for this demo and for our purposes today, we're passing code. And then it opens the URL in a web browser. So that's the part where it comes up and says, hey, do you want to approve this app to use your information? Then the second part, when you hit the get access token button, then it goes and it calls the token URL. So there's another URL that Dropbox has specifically to hand out these access tokens. So we send the request to that token URL, and we pass it our authorization code. So we tell it, hey, we're passing you an authorization code, and then we give it the code that they gave us from the previous step. Then we make the call, and once we make that call, Dropbox on their end verifies the information that we give them, and then they spit back our access token. And then that's what we need to actually go forward and communicate with the rest of Dropbox. Uploading files, getting what files are currently there, that kind of thing. So, all right, so then the other part of this, again, so that requires 2 manual steps to get the authorization code, copy and paste it, and then get the access code. Over here, we're going to do it all in one step. And again, this is a little bit more of an advanced topic because it does involve a PHP page, but let's go ahead and make sure my PHP page is running.
There are other questions here. For those of you who missed this, and you'll probably hear this in a second, I managed to quit my browser, so I lost the ongoing conversation on Twitch. So there was a question, probably about a 3 or 4 line question that was asked by someone right before this, a little bit ago, and we haven't got to it yet. Can you see that one? It's like a 3-line question.
Yeah, it's on Twitch.
Yeah. YouTube actually preserves the. Yeah.
I'm going to be connecting our BigCommerce store to FM for both push and pull of data, order API, and products API from both Big C. Since customers log into our store, I assume I need OAuth, but since technically both endpoints are internal and not customer facing, can I bypass that? That's actually a really good question. It depends on what they're logging into. Are they logging into your service, or are they logging into the third-party BigCommerce service? So do they have an account with BigCommerce?
Did you read the question out loud? Because not everyone can see that question, right? The people on YouTube can't see it, so just make sure you state it. Okay.
Yeah. So the question was, he's going to be connecting to a BigCommerce store for FM for push and pull of data. Since their customers log into their store, he's assuming that he needs OAuth, and he's wondering if he can bypass that. Again, if the login that you're talking about, the customer login that you're talking about is with BigCommerce, then yes, you will need to use OAuth. If their login is a service that you run or some kind of user system that you maintain, then no, you won't have to use OAuth. You can probably just use a API key or a generated token if it's your BigCommerce account that you're using.
Why does someone ask, why does OAuth have a two-step process?
It's for security. It's a handshake process that has basically two steps of verification to make sure that the developer that's using the service can actually access that user's account. Because, for instance, like I could make a Dropbox account, or not a Dropbox account, a Dropbox app, and distribute it in the App Store, and I can have people log into their Dropbox accounts. And if OAuth wasn't in place, like if Dropbox just allowed me to modify their or log into their API directly, I could potentially scrape a lot of people's information and reuse it other places. Um, Technically, I can still do that right now with an access token, but I can't get that unless that user logs in with their account. And once they log in, I can technically do whatever I want with their data. But that's why when that window comes up from Dropbox saying, "Hey, so and so wants access to your account," be careful because they can access your data and do what they want with it. So keep that in mind. So that's why OAuth exists, is to prevent situations like that. It's a layer of security for developers to utilize, third-party services within their own applications.
Yep, good one.
On a safe level.
Okay. Keep going. You're good. I'm answering a couple other questions. People are asking what popular services there are. Well, actually, you want to answer that real quick? From your perspective, Art, what have people asked you to connect to? Like
The ones I've seen the most are like Dropbox, PayPal. I've had a couple weather requests, and then the other APIs that I've worked with here specifically, or at least with my coaching customers, are a little bit more obscure ones that aren't necessarily like super popular. But Google APIs are definitely popular, whether that be their Maps, YouTube, or Mail or Calendar. Dropbox again. Stripe and Square, those ones for payment processing, those ones are pretty popular nowadays. So there's a whole laundry list of APIs. It just really depends on your business and what you need out of that service.
question time for everyone. So, questions. Christian Olson, are you there? Art, not forget Art, but Art can unmute himself when he's ready. Christian, any questions? The YouTube people. Okay, so it's really important. I want to cover something real quick, and that is we had a brand new person that was here, and I was talking to them, and it's the person. If you're following the YouTube conversation, it's the bunny person, and they're brand new to FileMaker, and they wandered into this webinar, and I know everyone who's more of a senior person just cringed when that happened because I didn't realize who they were or what their level of experience was. That they're brand new, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't think I'd have to code it this much." It's like, yeah, I know. This is the deep into the pool. So this right here is a graphical representation of how we identify the various developers kind of generally. We have business owners who just want stuff done. Then we have brand new people, which is like our bunny person. The conversation today is somewhere starting with people about right here and then moving forward to the right here. And so it's definitely the deep end of the pool. Most of the time we do training, the training is in this range here. Sometimes we get deeper. This API code stuff is decidedly very deep. And as a result of that, it's important that you understand that if today is your first steps on the moon, then probably we ought to just bleach your brain and erase it because it's really your bad first steps on the moon, right? I mean, it's just as like your first car and you get like a Formula One race car. I mean, that's not representative driving to town. So really, we have other webinars and sessions. So if you're brand new, we're talking to the bunny person. We understand you're over here. Just understand that today was not really intended for you.
All right. So what I want to show here is using the redirect URI. So I'm going to show you my account here for Dropbox, and this is one particular aspect that's going to be fairly important here. So in the Dropbox settings, the app console specifically, and you'll see this on other APIs that have OAuth 2 as well. you're going to see them talking about something called a redirect URI. And that is essentially a URL that you tell the service that, hey, once we go through the first part of the OAuth flow, getting the authorization code, we want you to pass that code to our redirect page so that we can handle it in the way that we want. So these PHP pages, and I'm going to get rid of some of these other ones for now. So this page right here points to a PHP page that I'm hosting locally, and I'll give you some instructions on how to test this on your own with the demo files. So this PHP page will be included in there, along with one that I use for the GoTo Meeting demo, which I'll show you in a second here. I want to make sure we go through that before we leave. But I'll share that with you guys, and I'll tell you how to run that and make it so that when the redirect call comes through, that your computer actually can handle it. So I'll show you here. If I log in, when I make the call to get the authorization code, I actually will pass this redirect URI as a parameter. So if I look at the auth code. So this is the first part. When I do the URL here, as you can see, I do pass it a parameter called redirect URI, and I point it to that redirect URL that we have there in the field. So when it opens, if I go log in, if you can see here up in the web in the URL field, you see how it added that as a parameter there. So what that's going to do is once I authorize it, so if I authorize it, Dropbox is then going to try to go to this page. So it's gonna make a call to that page that I told it to, and it's going to pass it the code. So I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. And before I hit allow, let me show you what that PHP page looks like. It's very small. It's like 3 lines, and I'll just explain what it's actually doing. So before I hit allow there, this is the redirect PHP page. So all it does is it gets the code that's passed from Dropbox, and then it opens up the FileMaker file using the FMP protocol, and it calls the file. So here's RCC Dropbox OAuth demo v2, which is what my file was called. And then in that protocol, FileMaker actually makes it really nice that you can call scripts and pass parameters through that protocol. So as you can see, I have a URL parameter after the question mark called script, and the script name is handle redirect. And then I have another field or another parameter in here called param, and that is the code that I get from Dropbox. So once I get that, and Dropbox then calls this page, I get the code, and then I open up FileMaker, which will then call this script right here, handle redirect. Gets the code passed in from the PHP page, and then we just make sure that we actually got a code back. And then we set our code field, and then we then go grab our access token. So if I close this, and if I come back over here to Dropbox and I allow, you're going to see it's going to prompt me to open up FileMaker 18. So if I hit allow, right now it's not making the call correctly, but I'm not going to take the time to fix that right now. But the version that you guys get will be working correctly. But essentially, when it comes back, it gives us the auth token. And over here in my terminal, and this will be in the instructions for running the PHP page locally on your computer. Over here, you can see redirect underscore dropbox.php, and then you can see the code that got passed. So this right here is what Dropbox passed back to us as the authorization code. And then when we open up FileMaker, and we call this handle redirect script, it then passes that to the access token script to get the final access token. Again, that is a bit of a more advanced topic and feature of FileMaker Server and FileMaker Pro, but technically this is the more correct way to handle OAuth. As I showed you with the previous demo where we can just copy and paste it in there, Dropbox makes it very easy because they actually give you a page to do that. Before we go here, I'm going to show you another example of OAuth that's a little bit different. So over here, this is GoTo Meetings API, and they do also use OAuth, but they do it a little bit differently. So as you can see, just by looking at the fields that we have here, there's a bit of some extra information here that wasn't in the Dropbox one. So for instance, GoTo Meeting gives us a refresh token and an expiration period and date, whereas Dropbox does not. I think to my knowledge, Dropbox, I don't think their access tokens expire. But this is the main difference between this and GoTo Meeting. Otherwise, the process itself is pretty much the same. So if I hit login here, it's going to take me to GoTo Meeting. I'm already signed in to GoTo Meeting, so it doesn't have me confirm or anything. And I already approved this app, so it already knows. So it's going to ask me to open FileMaker 18. And then now I have my authorization code, my OAuth code, and a refresh token. So some APIs will give you an expiration date for the access token, or expires in. It's not a date. This date I actually calculated myself. The only thing they give me is that it expires in 3,600 seconds, which is an hour. So over here in the JSON, the raw JSON, you can actually see right here, expires in, and then they give me my refresh token, and they give me my access token. So because the access token only lasts for an hour, if an hour goes by and you try to make another call to the API with that access token, the API is going to spit back an error saying, hey, your token has expired. And what you'll do in that situation is you will pass it the refresh token. So there's an endpoint that you'll pass it to that will essentially validate the refresh token, and it'll give you a new access token with a new hour time limit. And that makes it easier so that you don't have to have that person log back into their account and go through that OAuth flow again. You can just in the background make a refresh token call and have it just refresh. So like right now, if I hit refresh token, what it's going to do is it's going to pass this this refresh token back to GoTo Meeting, and we're going to end up with a new OAuth token, new access token, and a new refresh token and a new expiration date. So if I hit that, see, gives me new tokens. If I clear everything and then of course log in again, then it just goes through that process. So if you're already logged in on your web browser, it'll just automatically, and you've already approved the app, then it'll just go through and allow you to go through. If you're not signed in, or if you've never approved the app before, obviously it will stop you for those steps.
Art, hang on one second here.
The emergency disrupt system is now activated.
All right, we do have a minor problem here. The ship is going to blow up, and so we do have the, for those of you who recognize that. So.
And actually that is good timing because that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover today. There's still more to learn as far as working with APIs, but it really just takes getting into it and starting to play around with them on your own. Once you expose yourself to enough APIs, you kind of start to see the patterns and what implementations they might have, what they might not have, and you'll be able to then get started and actually move stuff into FileMaker a lot quicker as you get more experience. But that's the main thing there.
All right, so Art, what else we got?
I'm not seeing any other questions. So I mean, I guess if you have questions, definitely send them to support@rcconsulting.com. And if you're interested in training, we definitely have a couple of coaches in the company that can definitely help you guys with some API stuff. And then, of course, Richard here will give you a little bit more info on that as well.
No, I won't. We're leaving. I'm getting the hell off the ship. So.
Okay. Well, any other questions, if we didn't get to them today, just make sure you send them out to support@rcconsulting.com.
All right, everyone. We'll have a good one. I appreciate it. Once again, you can. Feel free to subscribe and sponsor us and support the channel before it blows up. That would be really awesome. All right. That's it, everyone.